It was the kind of summer night that settled over the Appalachian hills like a woolen shroud, heavy, humid, and unwilling to let go. On June 18, 1990, as the sun sank behind the ridgeline and dusk spilled its last gold onto the grounds of the Heart of Mercy Convent in eastern Kentucky, 3 young women stood at the threshold of the chapel, their silhouettes framed by stained glass and fading light. None of them knew it would be the last time anyone ever saw them alive. Sister Mary Grace, age 23, stood with her hands clasped tightly in prayer, her knuckles pale, her lips moving in silence. She had always been the calm one, soft-spoken, devout, the kind of girl people trusted without asking why. Beside her, Sister Rachel Ann, 24, stared blankly at the crucifix above the altar. Her shoulders were tense, her breathing shallow. And then there was Sister Sarah Jean, just 21, the youngest of the 3, who turned her head at the sound of thunder rolling in the distance. The storm was coming, and so was the silence. The convent stood like a forgotten fortress on a forested hill outside the small town of Claybrook, population 612 at the last count, a place where the church bells still marked the hours, where gossip spread faster than wildfire, but certain things were never, ever spoken of. The Heart of Mercy had been there for over a century, run by the Sisters of Sacred Grace, a closed order known for their strict adherence to obedience, solitude, and penitence. Few entered, fewer still ever left. That night the routine went on like any other. Vespers at 6:00 p.m., silent dinner at 6:30, lights out at 9:00 sharp. No one reported anything strange. No one saw the girls pack bags. No doors were found open. Their beds were made. Their habits hung neatly on the pegs by their cots. By morning, they were gone. No police report was filed. The Mother Superior told the congregation the girls had chosen to return to the secular world. The diocese issued a single-page statement to the local paper. "We mourn the loss of 3 promising vocations, but we respect their decision to leave. There is no cause for concern." And just like that, they vanished, without ceremony, without inquiry, without a trace. But there were whispers. A kitchen sister swore she'd heard crying in the hallway around midnight. A groundskeeper mentioned seeing flickering candlelight in the woods near the chapel, long after curfew. One novitiate said she found a rosary, splintered, at the foot of the altar that morning, with what looked like a smear of dried blood on the stone floor. They were told to forget. They did. Except for one. 31 years later, the past would come knocking, carrying a letter yellowed by time, a name spoken like a prayer and a warning, and the stubborn love of a sister who never stopped asking, what really happened to Mary Grace, Rachel Ann, and Sarah Jean? And why did the church want everyone to forget? It arrived folded 4 times and tucked inside the back of an old family Bible. Abigail Parker hadn't seen the book in over a decade. It had belonged to her mother, who had passed the month before, and she'd been sorting through dusty boxes in the attic of the family home in Lexington when the brittle envelope slipped from between the pages of Leviticus. The handwriting stopped her cold. It was Sarah Jean's, no doubt. Curvy letters, soft pressure like someone trying not to press too hard on the truth. Abigail sat on the attic floor as the fan whirred behind her and read the letter once, then again. The date in the upper right corner, June 17, 1990, one day before her sister vanished. Dear Mama, if you're reading this, something has happened. I want you to know I did not run away. None of us did. There are things inside the convent, things we were never meant to see. I can't write it all. I'm scared they'll find this, but if I go missing, please don't believe them. Don't let them bury us twice. There was no signature, only the initials S.J. and a line beneath. Tell Abby to remember the red door. Abigail stared at the paper until her fingers began to shake. The red door. It had been a joke between them as kids. Whenever Sarah felt nervous before a test or a trip, she'd say, "I'll find the red door." It was code for courage, for faith, for escape. And now, decades later, it was a breadcrumb. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Abigail packed a single suitcase and filled her car with gas. She hadn't been back to Claybrook since the funeral in '94, and she'd never once stepped foot on the grounds of the convent where Sarah had taken her vows. But now she had a map, a letter, and a silence that needed breaking. The road to Claybrook hadn't changed much in 30 years. The same 2-lane stretch of cracked asphalt wound through green hills, past silent barns and rusted mailboxes like time had skipped this part of Kentucky. Abigail Parker kept her hands tight on the steering wheel as the miles fell behind her. She hadn't been here since the fall of 1994, after her mother's funeral, and she'd promised herself she'd never come back. But promises made in grief don't always hold. Now, 31 years after her sister vanished from the Heart of Mercy Convent, Abigail was back, armed with a single yellowed letter, a half-faded memory, and the kind of ache that never goes away. Sarah Jean had been 17 when she joined the convent. Too young, their father had said. Too pure for that place, their mother had whispered once in the kitchen, hands deep in dishwater. But Sarah had been stubborn in that gentle way of hers. She believed in things: hope, forgiveness, redemption. And when the letter came from the convent saying they would accept her into their novitiate program, she had packed her bags without hesitation. A year later, she was gone. No phone call, no visit, no explanation. Just a short, cold letter from the Mother Superior claiming Sarah and 2 others had chosen to leave. No forwarding address, no investigation, and, worst of all, no questions. At 16, Abigail had been too young to understand the silence, but now, at 47, she knew better. You don't just erase 3 girls from existence, not unless someone wants them gone. She passed the old "Welcome to Claybrook" sign, its paint faded, the bottom rusting out, and felt the weight of every memory she'd tried to bury rise from the soil like fog. She drove slowly through the center of town, past the post office, the boarded-up grocery store, the little white church where they'd once held Easter services. Most storefronts were shuttered now, the windows covered in yellowing paper. Even the library looked like it hadn't had visitors in years. People didn't talk about Claybrook much. It wasn't on maps, not really, not unless you zoomed in far enough, but people remembered it, quietly, in the margins of newsprint, and whispered stories from someone who had a cousin who'd been there once. She pulled into the parking lot of the old roadside motel, the same one she remembered from childhood trips. The sign still blinked vacancy, though half the bulbs were out. At the check-in desk, an older woman in a pink cardigan looked up and frowned slightly. "Need a room?" she asked. "Yeah, just a few days." Name, ID, signature, the usual. The woman glanced at the license, then looked back at Abigail. "Parker," she said slowly. "Any relation to Sarah Jean?" Abigail's hand froze over the credit card slip. Her voice was quiet. "She was my sister." The woman blinked, then gave a small nod. No more questions. No expression. Just like everyone else in this town. They all knew, or at least they knew to forget. Room 4 faced the hill. Abigail pulled the curtains open and stared at the shape rising behind the trees. The convent was still there, barely. Its roof sagged. The steeple leaned. Ivy clung to every wall like a hand trying to pull the whole place underground. It looked smaller than she remembered, but heavier somehow, like it carried weight that no one had ever dared lift. She took the letter from her bag and read it again. The paper crackled in her hands. "We didn't leave. Please don't believe that. There are things here. They watch us. They listen. If anything happens, don't let them bury our voices." At the bottom, Sarah had written, "Tell Abby to remember the red door." The red door. It had been their code growing up. a shared phrase when things got scary. Before a dentist appointment. Before saying goodbye on the first day of school. "Just picture the red door," Sarah would say. "Walk through it. That's where it gets better." Abigail hadn't thought of that in decades, but now the memory burned bright. She sat on the edge of the motel bed and stared out the window as the sun began to drop behind the hills. Thunder rolled in the distance. Storm coming. Same kind of storm that had hit Claybrook the night Sarah disappeared. She didn't believe in signs. Not really. But that night, as the rain started to fall and the wind howled through the trees like a voice looking for someone to listen, she dreamed of her sister, standing at a red door, barefoot and shivering, whispering, "Don't stop looking." And Abigail knew she wouldn't. Not this time. Morning came gray and low, with mist crawling across the hills like something alive. Abigail woke early. She hadn't really slept, more like hovered somewhere between memory and nightmare. She dressed in jeans, hiking boots, a windbreaker, and packed her sister's letter, a flashlight and a small voice recorder she'd brought on instinct. At 7:12 a.m., she parked just off the old gravel access road that once led directly to the Heart of Mercy Convent. There were no signs now, no welcome, no warnings. Just a crooked fence covered in rust and vines, and behind it, a broken building that looked like it had tried to crumble but hadn't quite been allowed. She stood at the fence for a long time. The convent sat at the top of a hill, the chapel spire half collapsed, one stained glass window completely shattered, the others faded like bruises. Ivy had overtaken most of the brick, and the iron gate that had once closed visitors out now hung open on one hinge, swaying in the wind. A crow landed on the gate post and stared at her. She stared back. Then she stepped through. The path leading up the hill was overgrown but visible. Stone steps still clung to the slope beneath wild grass and creeping moss. Every footfall seemed to echo. The air was thick, still, and smelled faintly of rain, old stone, and something else, something faintly metallic. She climbed slowly, eyes scanning everything, windows, doors, corners. When she reached the top, the first thing she saw was the red door, or what used to be red. The paint had chipped and peeled, revealing gray wood underneath, but the faint hue of crimson remained in the grooves. It stood at the side of the chapel building, low, narrow, almost hidden. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it entirely. Abigail felt her chest tighten. Her sister's handwriting echoed in her mind. "Remember the red door." She reached out. The handle was rusted but not locked. She gave it a small tug. Nothing. It resisted like it hadn't moved in decades. She pressed harder. The hinges moaned. The door gave way an inch, then another. Inside was dark. She flicked on her flashlight and stepped into a small vestibule, empty, dust-choked and silent. Cobwebs hung like curtains. Broken wooden chairs lined the walls. A crucifix lay face down on the floor, splintered in half. It smelled like mildew. And something else. Something older. Decay. She swallowed hard and kept moving. At the end of the corridor, she found the chapel itself. Even in ruin, it still had a kind of haunted beauty. Tall ceilings arched like ribs overhead. Pews rotted in rows. Sunlight trickled through shattered stained glass, pooling on the cracked marble floor in watery colors. And there, near the altar, something caught her eye. A small, handmade rosary. The beads were wooden, worn. The cross at the end had been split clean down the middle. Someone had wrapped a strip of linen around it, like a bandage. She picked it up carefully. There were initials carved faintly into one bead. S.J. Sarah Jean. Her heart seized. The room spun slightly. She crouched down and noticed something else. A faint, irregular groove in the stone floor, like it had been scratched. Deliberately. Over and over. She brushed away the dust with the sleeve of her jacket. There, carved faintly in a trembling hand, were 3 words: "We are here." The silence in the chapel grew louder. Suddenly, she heard it. A shuffle. From somewhere deep in the building. Abigail froze. Her breath hitched. It came again. A dragging sound, faint, distant, maybe down a hallway, maybe not real, but maybe very, very real. She turned off the flashlight, waited, listened. Nothing. She backed out of the chapel slowly, moving through the vestibule, pushing the red door open with her back. Once outside, she ran. Back down the hill. Through the gate. To her car. Locked the doors. She sat for 10 full minutes, breathing like she just sprinted a mile. The rosary still clutched in her hand. Whoever, or whatever, was inside, it wasn't gone, and neither was her sister. She didn't know what she just found, but she knew what it wasn't. Forgotten. That afternoon, Abigail drove into town with her windows cracked open, trying to breathe, trying to think. The rosary sat in the cup holder like a whisper she couldn't shut out. "We are here." The words carved into stone rattled louder in her mind than the tires on the gravel road. She wasn't imagining it. Someone had left that message. Someone had made that rosary. And someone had been in the convent today. Whether living or dead, she wasn't sure. And somehow, not knowing was worse. She needed answers. Not theories, not folklore, real names, real voices. So she went looking for one. The Claybrook Senior Home sat at the edge of the town, a long, low brick building with a sagging roof and a peeling sign that read, "St. Mary's Extended Care." She remembered it from when she was a kid. It was where old teachers and retired priests went to disappear. A place full of people who had once mattered. She parked and walked to the front desk. A young nurse with a tired smile asked for her name. "I'm looking for Sister Catherine Monroe," Abigail said. The nurse hesitated. "She doesn't take visitors." Abigail lowered her voice. "Tell her I'm Sarah Jean Parker's sister." The nurse's eyes widened slightly, then she turned and disappeared down the hall without another word. 10 minutes later, she returned and motioned for Abigail to follow. Sister Catherine sat in a wheelchair near a window, staring out at a courtyard with nothing growing in it. Her habit was pale blue, clean but old. Her face was lined deep, her eyes sunken but sharp. "You look like her," she said before Abigail could speak, "but older, harder." "I've had time," Abigail replied, taking the seat beside her. "You knew my sister?" Catherine's lips pressed into a tight line. "I knew all 3. Mary Grace, Rachel Ann, Sarah Jean," Abigail said slowly. "They didn't leave, did they?" The old nun was silent for a long time. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "They asked too many questions, and they were too brave for that place." Abigail leaned forward. "What happened to them?" Catherine didn't blink. "They were taken." "Taken where?" The nun turned her head toward the window. "There are rooms under the convent, old ones, from the 1800s, maybe older, used for prayer retreats, silence fasts, purification rituals. That's what they called it. But in the 1980s, things changed. The Mother Superior then, Sister Irene, was obsessed with control, with obedience. Was Sarah in trouble? All 3 of them were. They kept notes, talked about telling the bishop, about going public. And someone stopped them. Catherine nodded. They were punished, they were sent below, but they were never seen again. I tried to ask. I was told they left, like you were told, but I knew better. We all did." Abigail felt cold all over. "Why didn't you speak out?" "Because I was a coward," Catherine said, "and because no one listens to a nun who asks questions." Abigail reached into her bag and pulled out the rosary. "This belonged to Sarah. I found it near the altar, and I found something carved into the floor, She paused. "We are here." Catherine's lips trembled. Then, for the first time, her voice cracked. "They're still down there." Abigail left the senior home just before sunset, heart pounding like a drum in her ears. The world outside looked the same, but nothing felt the same. She had confirmation, a living witness. There were underground rooms, the girls were taken there, and no one had ever brought them back out. That night she opened her laptop at the motel and searched everything she could: architectural records, property maps, diocesan archives, local newspapers from the summer of 1990. Most files were gone or incomplete, but she found a name: Father Emmett Caldwell. He had been assistant chaplain at Heart of Mercy the year her sister disappeared. Left the priesthood in 1991. No explanation, no obituary, just gone. Until she found a single hit. A P.O. box registered in Tennessee to E.C. Caldwell with a matching birth year. She copied the address, then stared at it for a long time. The next day she would drive out there. She didn't know what she'd find, but the door was open now, the silence was cracking, and someone, maybe a priest, maybe a coward, maybe the last man alive who knew what happened that night, was waiting. The Tennessee line came quicker than Abigail expected. The road south cut through green hills and half-dead towns, past gas stations that hadn't changed their prices since the 90s and churches that seemed older than the roads they stood on. She drove 4 hours without stopping. The address she'd found led to a small town called Winder's Bluff, one of those forgotten dots on a map where streetlights blinked for no one. Father Emmett Caldwell lived in a run-down white bungalow with peeling paint and a sagging porch. A wind chime clinked lazily in the breeze. There was no name on the mailbox, just the number, 412. She parked across the street and sat behind the wheel, engine ticking as it cooled. He had been 34 in 1990. That would make him 65 now, if he was still alive, if he was still willing to talk. She got out, crossed the street, and stepped up onto the porch. The wood creaked under her feet. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A curtain moved slightly inside the front window, just enough for someone to look through. Then, nothing. She knocked one last time and called through the door. "My name is Abigail Parker. My sister was Sarah Jean Parker. She disappeared from the Heart of Mercy Convent in 1990. Silence. Then a heavy voice from behind the door rasped like it hadn't been used in days. "Go away." "I found her rosary," Abigail said, and a message scratched into the floor of the chapel. "We are here." A pause. The lock turned. The door opened. Father Emmett Caldwell looked like a man halfway undone. Tall, thin, hair all but gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembled as he leaned against the doorframe. He wasn't wearing a collar, just a threadbare sweater and jeans that hung loose on his frame. "Come in," he said, almost like a sigh. The house was quiet and bare, like someone had removed anything that could remember. No photos, no crosses, just bookshelves filled with dust-covered volumes, an ashtray overflowing with burned-out cigarettes, and a kettle on the stove that hadn't boiled in a long time. Abigail sat at the edge of the kitchen table. He sat across from her, hands folded, eyes cast downward. "I never thought I'd see someone from that place again," he said. "You left," she said. "Why?" "Because I couldn't live with what I knew, and what I didn't stop." Abigail leaned forward. "Tell me." He looked up. His eyes were glassy but sharp beneath it. "In June of 1990, those 3 girls, Mary Grace, Rachel Ann, and your sister, they came to me, not together, separately, but they were scared. They told me about secret meetings among the senior sisters, punishments that weren't in any manual, about things that happened in the lower halls at night. Screams, locked doors, whispers in Latin, obedience pushed too far." He swallowed. "They asked me to speak to the bishop. I told them I would, but I hesitated. I was afraid. I'd only been there 2 years. I didn't want to be thrown out. So you did nothing, Abigail said quietly. I waited 1 day too long. The night they disappeared, there was a storm. I remember because the power flickered. The bells rang at 3:30 a.m. Nobody knew why. That bell hadn't been used in years. I got up and walked to the chapel. I passed the side hallway, the one that leads to the catacombs under the convent. I saw Mother Irene standing there, and someone else. A man in civilian clothes. They were carrying something, a trunk. Heavy. He closed his eyes. It wasn't luggage. Abigail's stomach twisted. You think they were alive? I think they were silenced and sealed. Where? There's a chamber under the convent. It used to be used for solitude and extended prayer fasts. But in the last few years they started calling it something else. The Room of Reflection. But no one was ever seen leaving it. Why didn't you tell someone? Abigail snapped, her voice rising, his hands clenched. I tried. I told another priest. He reported me for spreading lies, said I was unstable. The diocese called it slander. I was reassigned. I resigned before they could bury me too. He looked at her now, his voice almost breaking. I have lived with their faces in my dreams for 30 years. I have prayed for forgiveness, knowing I never earned it. Abigail reached into her bag and placed Sarah's rosary on the table. He stared at it like it burned. There's still time, she said, to do something right. Before she left, he gave her one more thing, a hand-drawn map. It showed the convent's floor plan, including a hidden staircase beneath the chapel that led to the old chamber. He had drawn it from memory, shaky and unsure, but there was a mark, a red X at the far end of the tunnels. That's where they would have taken them, he said. If the rumors were true. Abigail folded the map carefully and slid it into her pocket. I'm going back in, she said. Father Caldwell didn't stop her. He didn't warn her. He only said one thing as she stepped out the door. If you hear the bells, get out. The wind picked up as Abigail drove north, back toward Kentucky. The clouds above the Appalachians had thickened into slate, and by the time she crossed into Claybrook again, the sun was gone, swallowed by the kind of dusk that made everything look like it was holding its breath. She didn't go back to the motel. Instead, she drove straight to the old convent. She parked at the base of the hill and sat in the car for several minutes, watching the silhouette of the crumbling building above her. The chapel's spire leaned like it wanted to fall but couldn't quite let go. A light drizzle tapped against the windshield. Abigail clicked on her flashlight and reached into her coat pocket. Sarah's rosary was still there. She wound it around her fingers once, then got out and walked into the mist. The path was slick, the grass wet and tall, slapping against her jeans. The same gate, rusted, open, silent. The same red door, now darkened by rain. She opened it slowly and stepped back inside. The chapel smelled the same. Stone, mildew, old wood, and something sour underneath it all. But tonight it was colder. Deader. She moved with purpose. Following the crude map Father Caldwell had drawn, she passed through the main nave and turned right toward a hallway that had once led to the sacristy. The floor creaked beneath her boots. Plaster had fallen in chunks from the ceiling. Candles lay on the ground, long melted to wax puddles. She reached the wall. The map said there should be a small wooden panel near the floor, just behind the third pillar on the right. She scanned with her flashlight. There, a warped board, slightly darker than the others. She knelt, ran her fingers along the edge, and found a shallow groove. She dug her nails in and pulled. The board popped free with a sound like a gasp. Behind it, a narrow passage, stone walls barely wide enough to fit her shoulders. The air rushed out, cold, stale, wrong. She hesitated. Then she switched on her flashlight, took one deep breath, and crawled inside. The tunnel sloped downward. The stone walls were moist, and the air thickened the deeper she went. Her breath echoed. Her flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Cobwebs brushed her face. Somewhere in the distance she thought she heard dripping. And then, footsteps. She froze. They were faint, uneven. Above her or in front? She held her breath, turned off the flashlight, and waited in complete blackness. Silence. Then, nothing. When she turned the light back on, she saw the stairs. Narrow, steep, made of uneven stone. At the base, a rusted iron gate hung off its hinges. Beyond it, a large chamber yawned open, black as a well. Abigail stepped through. The room of reflection wasn't large, but the ceiling was high, domed with black stone that looked like it had been chiseled out centuries ago. The walls were marked with symbols, crosses, Latin phrases, strange circular patterns like stylized eyes. In the center, a stone altar, and behind it, against the far wall, 3 iron rings bolted into the rock. Abigail's blood went ice cold. There were markings in the floor, scratches, gouges, scraped letters. She crouched with the flashlight. There, etched into the stone by trembling hands, "I can't breathe. Forgive us. We didn't run." SJP, 6/1890. Sarah. Abigail's throat tightened. She knelt lower. The floor was stained in places. She didn't want to guess with what. Suddenly, the air shifted. A gust. Cold. Behind her. She spun around. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall, slender, wearing dark clothes soaked by the rain, face hidden in shadow. Abigail stumbled backward, heart pounding. "Who are you?" The figure stepped forward, a voice calm, male, quiet. "You shouldn't be here." "Then tell me why she died here," Abigail shouted, her voice echoing off the stone. "Tell me what they did to my sister." The man paused. "I can't," he said, "but I can show you." He raised his flashlight and turned it toward the back wall. There was a second door, smaller, almost invisible behind a broken shelf. The man stepped aside, gesturing. Abigail hesitated, then walked past him, heart thundering. She pulled the door open. Inside, lit only by her beam, was a tiny room, cramped, bare, and carved into the stone, over and over with nails or stone or bone. "We are still here. No one listens. Please remember us." At the center of the room sat a small, rusted tin box. Abigail reached for it, her fingers trembling. She opened the lid. Inside, 3 folded slips of paper. On each, a name. Mary Grace. Rachel Ann. Sarah Jean. Beneath them, one final note, written in a different hand, jagged and angry. They begged. I obeyed. Now I burn with them. Abigail stepped back, dizzy. The man spoke again. "Not everyone down here was innocent, but your sister was." And then he turned and disappeared into the tunnel. Abigail climbed out of the convent as the storm broke. Thunder cracked over the hills. Rain poured sideways. She ran back to her car and sat soaking in the driver's seat, hands shaking around the tin box. She had proof now, names, dates, words carved in stone and bone and silence. They had been here all along, and someone, maybe many, had made sure they stayed buried. But not anymore. Not if she could help it. The rain hadn't stopped by morning. It pounded the motel window like fists, each drop demanding Abigail move faster. But she didn't sleep. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, the tin box open beside her. She reread the notes until her eyes blurred. They begged. I obeyed. Now I burn with them. Who had written that? One of the nuns? A priest? Someone like Caldwell? Too weak to stop it, too afraid to admit it? And the man in the tunnel. Who was he? He never said his name, never explained why he was down there, just disappeared into the dark like a ghost that finally told the truth and dissolved. Abigail didn't know what haunted her more, what she'd seen, or the fact that nobody else had been willing to look. But that was over. This time the silence wouldn't win. By noon, Abigail was in Lexington, standing in the cramped office of a local investigative journalist named Carla Dugan. Carla was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, with stacks of manila folders spilling across every flat surface of her cluttered newsroom. She listened without interrupting as Abigail laid out everything: the letter, the rosary, the carving in the chapel, the tunnel, the map, the tin box, the names. When she finished, Carla didn't speak. She just turned to her computer and began typing. "You understand," she said finally. "If we run with this, we can't stop halfway. The church will fight it. So will Claybrook. This could get ugly." "I'm not looking for revenge," Abigail replied. "I just want the truth out. I want people to say their names." Carla nodded. "Then let's start with that." By the end of the week, the story was live. 3 missing nuns. A secret room. A sister who never stopped asking. It spread fast. First local, then regional. By the following Monday, national outlets picked it up. Cold case reopened after sister uncovers hidden chamber under abandoned convent. Whispers of faith and fear. What really happened in Claybrook? Convent of silence. The photos were what hit the hardest. Carla's article included grainy shots of the underground room, close-ups of the carved messages, the rusted iron rings, the notes from the tin box, and the rosary, Sarah Jean's rosary, resting on the altar stone like a cross on a grave. People were horrified and fascinated. The Diocese of Lexington issued a bland statement. "We are aware of the allegations and are cooperating with local authorities." But they weren't cooperating, not really. Abigail returned to Claybrook 2 days after the story broke. Her motel room had been searched. Nothing taken, but the box had been moved and the notes unfolded like someone had handled them. She went straight to the sheriff's department. The local police opened a formal investigation, but it was clear from the first meeting they weren't eager. The sheriff, a thin man with a fixed smile and tired eyes, called it a sensitive matter. Abigail didn't trust his tone. When she offered to show them the tunnel, he shook his head. "We need to consult with the church before stepping onto private religious property." She stared at him. "It's abandoned. Still owned by the diocese and technically by the Vatican." There it was, the wall again. Thick, cold, holy. That night, Abigail drove back up the hill alone. The gate had been chained shut. A fresh padlock hung on it, new and gleaming. A sign had been posted in front. "No trespassing. Under investigation." She didn't have the key, but she knew what the sign really meant. Not under investigation. Buried again. The next morning, she stood in front of a camera crew on the courthouse steps. Carla stood beside her, holding copies of everything. Photos, statements, the map, the tin box. Abigail faced the lens, chin raised, voice steady. "My sister didn't run. Neither did Mary Grace or Rachel Ann. They didn't lose faith. They were silenced. Locked away by people who used obedience as a weapon and called it God." She took a breath. For 31 years, no one asked what happened to them. But now the world is asking, and I won't stop, not until they're given back their names, their dignity, and their truth. Behind her, reporters scribbled. Cameras clicked. One woman wept softly into her notebook. Later that night, Oscar Sarah Jean Parker trended across the country. But in Claybrook, it was different. The town split in two. Some people came by the motel and left flowers. Others left messages of support on her windshield. But others, silent, cold, turned their eyes away when she passed, muttered in the diner, slammed doors when she walked by. One morning, she found a handwritten note shoved under her motel room door. "Let the dead stay buried." But Abigail had no intention of stopping, because she wasn't just telling a story now, she was opening a crypt. And inside were truths that the church, the town, and the guilty had buried in stone and shadow, but she was no longer alone. There were reporters, there were cameras, and somewhere in the dark the dead were listening. Within a week of the press conference, the backlash arrived, quiet, polished, and dressed in cassocks. A high-ranking representative from the Diocese of Lexington appeared on the local news, flanked by legal counsel and a soft-spoken woman in a gray habit. He stood before a stone church with ivy curling around its base and spoke with careful precision. "We acknowledge the public's concern regarding the allegations surrounding the Heart of Mercy Convent. However, there is no current evidence to support the claim of wrongdoing or criminal conduct by members of the church. The building in question was closed due to structural instability. We urge the public not to jump to conclusions." He didn't mention the notes, he didn't mention the names, and he never said the word dead. The next day, Abigail's request to have the site officially excavated was denied. The letter came on crisp white paper with a golden seal. "Pending further review by ecclesiastical authorities, no authorization is granted for civilian or legal excavation beneath Heart of Mercy property. Access is restricted." Translation: stay out. They were locking the gates with prayer and red tape. But that night, in her motel room, Abigail received an email. No name, just an address and a subject line. She wrote it in the walls. The message was only one sentence. "Ask about the East Wing. June 1990. Room 8. Attached was a single image, an old black-and-white photo of the convent's second-floor hallway. 3 girls stood near a window, young, smiling, unaware that their faces would one day end up on missing persons posters. Abigail's hand shook. She zoomed in. Sarah Jean stood on the left, Rachel Ann in the center, and on the right, Mary Grace. Behind them, a wooden door. Room 8. The east wing had partially collapsed years ago, and the hallway was now barricaded. But the photo gave Abigail leverage. She printed it and brought it to Carla. Within hours, Carla made a call to a contact in a historical preservation group. That contact called someone in the state legislature. That someone forwarded it to a sympathetic local judge. And 3 days later, Abigail stood holding a signed court order, limited inspection of room 8, supervised and time-restricted. It wasn't much, but it was open air where there had been only concrete. On the morning of the inspection, 2 men from the state historical office joined Abigail and a local deputy at the convent. A locksmith cracked the padlock. The gate groaned open. As they climbed toward the building, the air felt heavier. The ground seemed to resist their steps. Inside, dust danced in the light like ash. Every room was cold and hollow, the silence thick as stone. They reached room 8. The door was warped but still standing. The deputy kicked it open. The stench hit them instantly. Mildew, mold, and something bitter, like old rot sealed too long. Inside, the room was empty. Just a bed frame, a shattered mirror, and one wooden chair turned away from the wall. The plaster was peeling in long strips, but then one of the inspectors crouched down. "There's something behind here," he said. He scraped the wall carefully with a blade. Behind the thin surface layer of plaster, a message. Faint but visible, scrawled in pencil or charcoal. Letters uneven and jagged. "We were told silence was holy, but silence is how monsters hide." And below it, 3 initials, M.G., June 1990, Mary Grace. It was real. Carla published the story that night, photos of the message, documentation of the court order, the photo of the 3 girls in the hallway. This time, the diocese couldn't call it speculation. But they tried. They released another statement calling the discovery a tragic and regrettable artifact of the convent's past, but warned the public not to infer guilt based on dated markings without context. They still refused to authorize a full excavation. They still called it a private matter of the church. But public pressure was building, and something else was happening too. Whispers began to spread. An elderly woman in Ohio wrote to Carla anonymously, "I was sent to Heart of Mercy in 1968. I heard screaming through the floorboards at night." Another message from a woman in Indiana. "I was there when the girls disappeared. I was 14. They told us never to ask, but I remember the bells. Each day more stories, each one a brick removed from the wall of silence." Then, 3 days after the roommate discovery, a letter arrived at Carla's office. No return address, no name. Inside was a copy of a personnel document from 1990. A transfer request. To Diocese of Lexington. From Sister Irene H.R.E. Reassignment of Sister Miriam Caldwell. Effective July 1st, 1990. At the bottom, in faded ink, request immediate removal. Subject has seen and heard too much. Suggest silent vows at St. Bridget Retreat House. Sister Miriam Caldwell. Caldwell. Abigail's hands trembled. She remembered Father Caldwell saying he left the priesthood in 91, but he never mentioned a sister. She almost missed the connection. Abigail stared at the transfer form until her eyes blurred. Miriam Caldwell. The surname had lit a match in her memory, but the real flame didn't catch until she opened her notebook and flipped back through her notes from her visit to Father Caldwell. He'd never mentioned any siblings, but the name was there, on an old photograph she'd taken from the convent archive during one of her first visits. A group photo from 1989. The Sisters of Heart of Mercy, standing in a row outside the chapel steps. Middle row, far left. A woman, maybe 25, with quiet eyes and a jaw that looked just like Emmett's. The caption under the photo read simply, "Sister Miriam C." It couldn't be coincidence. Abigail knew what that kind of silence meant. Someone had made her disappear too. The St. Bridget Retreat House was tucked into the woods outside Asheville, North Carolina. It wasn't on a public list of religious orders or directories. Carla's contacts had found it through archived grant applications from the early 2000s, quiet funding, mostly from private donors. The house didn't advertise, it didn't take visitors, and it didn't answer phones. But Abigail went anyway. She drove the 6 hours herself, her hands clenched on the steering wheel the whole way. Every mile felt heavier than the last. She arrived just before dusk. The retreat house was a 2-story stone building hidden behind a wall of pine. A gravel driveway curled like a question mark around a courtyard where wind chimes tapped gently in the breeze. The front door bore a wooden sign that read simply, "Quiet lives here." Abigail walked to the entrance and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Still nothing. She tried a third time, harder. A small panel slid open in the wooden door, revealing only a pair of eyes. Pale green, old, watchful. "I'm looking for Sister Miriam Caldwell," Abigail said softly. "Please, I think she's the only one left who knows the truth." A pause, then a quiet voice. "She hasn't spoken in 28 years. Abigail felt her heart sink. "Please, just let me see her." The eyes lingered. Then the panel slid shut. The door opened. The halls were quiet. No music, no prayers, just the soft shuffle of slippers on old wood and the smell of lavender and old books. The nun who let her in, Sister Eleanor said nothing as she guided Abigail down a narrow hallway and into a garden-facing room with a single wooden chair, a desk, and a window that looked out onto the trees. In the chair sat a woman in her 60s, thin, gray-haired, wrapped in a navy shawl. She looked up when Abigail entered. Her eyes were the same as Emmett's, piercing, tired, sad. Abigail sat across from her, slowly, gently placing Sarah's rosary on the table between them. Sister Miriam's eyes locked onto it. "I'm Abigail," she said. "Sarah Jean Parker was my sister." The nun didn't move. Her hands, folded on her lap, twitched once, then stilled. "I think you knew her," Abigail continued. "I think you saw what happened, and I think they took your voice because of it." Still nothing. Then Miriam reached, shakily, and touched the rosary. Her fingers trembled. Then, with effort, she turned to the desk drawer, pulled out a small notepad, and wrote with slow, jagged pen. "You remember." Abigail swallowed. "Yes." Another scribble. "They lied." "Yes," Abigail whispered, "I know." Miriam paused. Her eyes welled. Then she began to write. Slower now. Line after line. Page after page. Abigail waited, silent, still. The only sound, the turning of paper and the soft wind through the pine trees outside. When she finished, she pushed the pages across the table. Abigail read each line with her breath caught in her throat. They said it was penance, that the girls were too loud in spirit. Mother Irene told us they'd walked away from grace, but she had them taken below, locked in the room of reflection. She told us they needed time to repent. I heard screams the first night, then crying, then nothing. One night I went down to bring blankets. I wasn't supposed to. The door was unlocked. I looked in. Mary Grace was praying aloud. Her hands were bleeding from the stones. Rachel was curled up on the floor, whispering something over and over. Sarah Jean looked at me and said, "Tell my sister I didn't leave her." I tried to speak up. Sister Irene sent me away, said I had lost my spiritual center. They transferred me a week later. I took a vow of silence. They told me if I broke it, I would be excommunicated. I've waited 31 years for someone to ask. At the bottom, a final line in trembling pen. "I'm sorry I didn't save them." Abigail folded the pages carefully and stood. Sister Miriam reached across the table and held her hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Because there's some truths that don't need sound to echo. And in that quiet room, Abigail understood. This was a woman who had carried the weight of 3 souls for decades. Now, at last, she was setting them down. By the time Abigail returned to Kentucky, the media had exploded again. Carla had published excerpts from Miriam's handwritten confession with her permission. The headlines screamed now, "Witness breaks 31-year silence." Convent horror, survivor says nuns were locked to die. Where is Mother Irene? But that was the new mystery. Because when the story broke and people began searching, Mother Irene was nowhere to be found. No records, no grave, no retirement home. It was like she'd vanished. But Abigail knew better. Someone who could disappear 3 girls without a trace knew exactly how to disappear herself. The hunt for Mother Irene began as a media frenzy, but quickly became something stranger and darker. The diocese released a statement claiming she had retired in 1998 due to declining health and had been moved to a private religious care facility. But they refused to disclose where. No address, no contact, no obituary, no death certificate. It was like she'd walked into a fog and never come out. Carla dug deeper. Public records showed nothing. No Medicare data, no Social Security filings, no passport, no property. Just a thin paper trail that ended cold at the end of the 90s. A woman who'd run a convent for decades had vanished without even leaving dust behind. That wasn't retirement. That was erasure, and Abigail wasn't going to let her disappear. Not after what she'd done. The lead came from a librarian named Wendy in St. Louis. She had read the news coverage and contacted Carla, saying she'd once helped archive files from a small, now-defunct Catholic hospice in Missouri, a place called St. Alpha's Rest. It had been run by a private order not affiliated with any major diocese, and it had taken in retired religious personnel. It shut down in 2004, but one of the last residents, a woman named Sister Irene H., listed only by initials with no known family. Wendy still had copies of the intake logs. She sent them over. The listed age matched. So did the handwriting sample Carla had obtained from an old note at the convent. Abigail drove to Missouri the next morning. St. Alpha's Rest was nothing but a crumbling stone ruin now, half swallowed by the woods. Ivy coated the windows. The roof had partially collapsed. But the main building still stood. Abigail stepped through the broken door and found nothing but silence. Peeling wallpaper, overturned chairs, water damage. The walls smelled of mildew and something else. Chemical rot. She walked slowly through the halls, checking door after door. And then, in what had once been a records room, she found a rusted filing cabinet, jammed. Water swollen. She pried it open with a crowbar she'd brought just in case. Inside, blackened, unreadable papers, except one sealed in a cracked plastic sleeve. A discharge document. Dated August 2004. Name: Irene H. Condition, nonverbal. Declining cognitive function. Status: released to private guardianship. Destination redacted. At the bottom, a note handwritten by a nurse. Subject: not fit for hospice. Transferred per instruction of diocese. No forwarding information. And a final scribble in the margin, nearly illegible. She said something before she left, whispered it twice. They heard the bells. Abigail stared at the page. The bells. That was the third time she'd heard the phrase. First, from Reverend Clay back in Claybrook. Second, from the letter she found slipped under her motel door. Now, from a dying woman who had spent decades hiding. They heard the bells. It had to mean something. That night, Carla called with news. A forensics team had completed preliminary tests in the room of reflection. Soil samples taken near the eastern wall had tested positive for human decomposition markers, phosphorus, and calcium levels consistent with long-term organic decay. There were bodies, still down there, still buried. And with that evidence, everything changed. The judge overseeing the investigation authorized a full forensic excavation of the Heart of Mercy Convent. The walls were finally coming down. On a rainy Tuesday, Abigail stood on the hill again, this time surrounded by a full team. Law enforcement, journalists, forensic anthropologists. Floodlights lit the ruins. Tents were set up. Yellow tape lined the perimeter. It no longer felt like a ghost story. It felt like a crime scene, because it was. At noon, they broke through the foundation of the old prayer chamber. Beneath it, under concrete and brick, they found a sealed crawlspace. Inside, packed tightly into the soil, were 3 sets of skeletal remains. All female. All consistent in age with Sarah Jean, Rachel Ann, and Mary Grace. Each one still wore remnants of a habit. Each one was found near a rusted iron ring in the wall. Each one, a secret someone thought would never be uncovered. DNA testing would take time. But Abigail didn't need it. She knew. They had found them. They had finally come home. By week's end, the convent was declared a crime scene. A second investigation opened, this time not just into negligence, but into potential homicide, obstruction, and cover-up by church officials. Pressure mounted on the diocese. Protesters gathered at the Lexington Cathedral. Former parishioners wrote open letters demanding accountability, and through it all, Abigail remained steady. At Sarah's graveside, her real one, now finally marked, she stood in the drizzle, rosary in hand, and whispered the words her sister once scratched into stone. "We didn't run." But the story wasn't over, because someone had helped cover it up. Someone had helped move Mother Irene in secret. Someone had funded it all, kept it quiet for 3 decades, and that someone had just been identified. Not a priest, not a nun, but a bishop. A name Abigail knew. One her sister had once written in the margins of a letter long ago. Bishop Marcus Ellery. For 31 years, his name had floated quietly through church bulletins, diocesan newsletters, and Easter masses, always at the top of the program, always framed in gold. Bishop Marcus Ellery, tall, articulate, beloved by many. The kind of man who could command a room without raising his voice. The kind of man reporters never questioned too deeply, until now. Abigail didn't recognize his name at first. Not until she went back through Sarah's old letters. One in particular stood out, dated May 1990, a month before the disappearance. I overheard them talking in the rectory kitchen after morning prayer. Mother Irene was speaking with a man she called His Grace. He said the girls were stirring doubt and that if they wouldn't stop, steps must be taken. She said she would handle it. I think I believe her. But something about him chilled me. His name was Bishop Ellery. Back then, Ellery had been a rising star. Only 42, just promoted from auxiliary bishop to lead the Lexington diocese. Now he was 73, and he was in trouble. Carla ran with it. Within 48 hours, she published a new exposé. The Man Behind the Silence. Did Bishop Ellery cover up the Heart of Mercy disappearances? It wasn't just speculation. They had paper trails now. Carla's team traced a series of discretionary disbursements made from diocesan accounts in mid-1990, funds labeled as emergency facility repairs and restricted staff relocation support. Over $40,000 in total, redirected with no itemized explanation. All signed by then Bishop Marcus Ellery. Then came the transfers. Sister Irene had been moved without a formal record. Father Emmett Caldwell had been reassigned out of state after speaking to a colleague about the missing girls. That same colleague had been suspended within the year. Each trail led back to the same office. Ellery's? The church issued its most carefully worded statement yet. We are reviewing the serious allegations raised against Bishop Marcus Ellery. We understand the deep pain this case has caused the Claybrook community and the families involved. Out of respect for the ongoing civil investigation, we will refrain from public comment at this time. But privately, sources told Carla that the Vatican had already sent emissaries. Damage control had begun. And Abigail knew what that meant. The machine was working again, the one that buried the truth for 3 decades, the one that polished monsters into martyrs. So she pushed harder. She demanded a formal deposition of Bishop Ellery. She filed it through her attorney. It was denied, so she went public. She appeared on national television, sitting across from a seasoned anchor who wore sorrow like a necktie. My sister was 19, she said. She had taken vows of compassion, not silence. She believed the church would protect her. Instead, it buried her. The anchor leaned forward. Do you believe Bishop Ellery gave the order? Abigail didn't blink. I believe he opened the door and turned off the light behind them. The next day, Ellery stepped down. No press conference, no apology, just a press release. Health-related resignation, effective immediately. But the grand jury wasn't finished. On a rainy Thursday morning in November, agents served a warrant at Ellery's residence. Inside, they found a locked drawer in his home office containing a bundle of letters marked Confidential, 1990. Most had been written by Mother Irene. One was from a private investigator she had hired that same summer, and one, tucked at the very back, was from Sarah Jean Parker. It was dated June 15, 1990. To His Grace Bishop Ellery, I write this in hope that someone in power still believes in truth. Sister Rachel and I have uncovered things we do not understand. Private rooms beneath the chapel. Punishments kept off the record. Confessions extracted by fear, not faith. We were warned not to speak. We ask only this: look into Mother Irene's practices. Speak to the novices. Please, if we are wrong, we will accept any consequence. But if we are right, will you help us or bury us? He never responded. He filed it away. And then she vanished 3 days later. When Abigail read it, she wept, not because it shocked her, but because it didn't. Sarah had reached out even then, even in fear, and still no one listened. Until now. 2 weeks later, Bishop Ellery was officially indicted by a grand jury for obstruction of justice, abuse of ecclesiastical authority, and tampering with evidence in a criminal investigation. He was arrested quietly at his private chapel. When asked by reporters if he had any comment, he said only one thing before being ushered into the waiting car. They rang the bells themselves. Abigail stood alone outside the courthouse that afternoon, holding her sister's rosary. She didn't feel triumph, not justice exactly, but maybe silence had finally changed sides. And the bells, maybe they were ringing now, for the girls who were never meant to be heard. It took 3 months for the excavation to finish and 2 more for the remains to be officially identified. Sarah Jean Parker, Rachel Ann Doyle, Mary Grace Bellamy. Each name now stood in legal documents, not just on prayer cards or missing posters. The forensics matched dental records and DNA samples provided by the families. There was no longer any doubt. They had been found, and someone had put them there. On a bright spring morning, nearly 32 years to the day since their disappearance, the town of Claybrook held a public memorial. People came from all over: Sarah's former classmates, Rachel's childhood neighbors from Indiana, Mary Grace's elderly parents who had outlived their daughter by decades without ever knowing where she had gone. Reporters lined the sidewalk. A few protesters came too, old parishioners who still whispered about respecting the church, still afraid of the truth. But most came to mourn and to listen. The memorial was held not in a church, but outside the rebuilt chapel of Heart of Mercy, now an official state historical site, permanently closed to religious use. The once crumbling red door had been preserved, framed in clear glass. Beneath it, a plaque now read, "In memory of those whose voices were taken, whose silence was forced. May they never be forgotten." Abigail stood at the podium, her notes in hand, though she hardly glanced at them. My sister was 19. She loved music. She made terrible tea. She prayed every night with the same words, "Let me be brave." Her voice cracked, but she continued. She didn't run. None of them did. They stood up, they spoke out, and they were silenced by the very place they trusted most. But they are silent no longer. She paused. Some say God sees everything. I believe that, but I also believe that sometimes He waits for us to open the door. She stepped away to the sound of quiet weeping and distant birdsong. Then, at exactly noon, the rebuilt bell tower rang. 3 solemn peals. 1 for Sarah. 1 for Rachel. 1 for Mary Grace. Bishop Ellery never stood trial. He died in federal custody 2 weeks before his court date. Complications from a stroke. He left no final statement, no confession. But it no longer mattered. The truth had already been dragged into the light. Sister Miriam Caldwell lived out her final years at the St. Bridget Retreat, where Abigail visited her often. The two of them spoke in a kind of rhythm that didn't need words. In time, Miriam began writing again, letters to the families of the girls, simple words of remorse, and memories no one else had kept alive. Father Emmett Caldwell passed quietly in Tennessee. Abigail attended his funeral. There were only 6 people there. She placed Sarah's rosary in his casket. She thought Sarah would have wanted that. Carla's documentary, The Convent That Tried to Forget, premiered on national television 6 months later. It won awards. More importantly, it forced multiple dioceses across the country to reopen investigations into past abuses and disappearances. Claybrook, once known for its silence, now stood for something else: the danger of obedience without question. Abigail moved back to Lexington eventually, not because it was easy, but because she wanted to finish what Sarah had started. She joined a non-profit that worked with survivors of institutional abuse. She spoke at schools, at churches, at hearings. Her voice never shook again, and each year on June 18th she returned to Claybrook and stood at the glass-framed red door. Not to grieve, but to promise. On the 33rd anniversary, a child visiting the site with her school group pointed to the bell tower and asked, "Why do they ring the bells?" Abigail knelt beside her. "To remember the girls who lived here," she said. "To remind the world that being quiet isn't the same as being safe." The child nodded slowly. "Did anyone ever hear them?" Abigail smiled. "They did now.